I'm going to take my life in my hands and I'm going to ask for questions from the floor. The old-fashioned way of doing things. All I'd ask you to do, please, is wait for the microphone to find you, give your rank, if relevant, name, organisation, and please, a very short question. If it is to an identified member of the panel, please say so. Otherwise, I will just see how many members of the panel are willing to answer that question. So please, if you raise your hands in the normal way, we'll try and get a microphone to you as quickly as we can. So first question, please. So lady down here, please. Thank you.
And with apologies, because I'm losing my voice, this is a question to John and to David. Both of you undertook considerable change in your organisations. What did you put into place to ensure that when you're gone or when you move on, it won't revert to how it used to be, slip back into its comfort zone of how it used to be?
Thank you.
I think David made this point rather eloquently, actually. You know, in the end, I always believe you can only change the culture of a place by changing the nature of by changing the experiences that people have in a place. So what I'm worrying about, and I talked a little bit about it, but what I'm focused on mostly in the public sector is to change the career paths for young people coming in so that in 5 to 8 years' time they will have a different set of experiences. So we can do some structural stuff, we can change those career paths, but the real point is that when they get to be the leadership of the civil service, they will have a different set of experiences and therefore they will operate in a different way. And that's really, I suppose, in the short answer to your question from my perspective.
Yeah, so I had a two-pronged strategy. One was I wanted to embed the language changes so deeply that they became the cultural norm and a single outsider would adapt to the group rather than the other way around. And the second thing is I thought about changing the structures. Now, in the Navy, as a submarine commander, there are not a lot of structural changes that you have control over, but the way Navy regs read is there's da-da-da, these are the regulations, da-da-da, there's no asterisk. And you read down the asterisk, it said, under extenuating circumstances, the commanding officer may modify these regulations. And I drove a freight train through that asterisk. And so I would take things like very simple things, not scary things. A form would say, you guys have forms, I'm guessing. It would say submitted, reviewed, maybe more reviewed, approved. And we would simply change it to submitted, reviewed, approved, informed. We would keep it to the same, it would end up at the same spot, but the decision had already been made, or it was made with intent. Another thing that we did was I changed who got to sign off on the holiday or the leave for the soldiers. This was the huge camel's nose in the tent event, where before it had to go up to the second in command, the first officer, and I just took a big black marker and I just lined it out and it said now it's the chief. So no officers would sign any enlisted person's vacation. And that ended up being hugely, hugely powerful. But on the whole, I thought I was making momentous changes, but in the big scheme of things, I didn't have as much freedom of maneuver there.
Thank you. I believe Nick Gowing has also got a point.
Yeah, we see very clearly you've got to embed a process. You've got to embolden, and you've got to get the next generation to buy in. Therefore, it becomes irreversible. It's less the systems, it's more the human capacity and the human determination to do it. And that's where Chris and I have focused our work. But if I may, John, one example within your 28 pillars of the civil service, and it didn't involve you, there was one large organization which came to us and said, would we go and do a lunchtime presentation about thinking the unthinkable? We said, but what happens next? What kind of process are you going to introduce? How do you sustain something which keeps going? And we didn't do it because we felt we were almost doing it as a freak show, to turn up, have an interesting time, a brown bag lunch, but nothing would ever happen. We're still in discussion.
Margaret.
I mean, I would say you can't guarantee it'll last. And maybe you don't want it to. Because, you know, what we're talking about, all of us today, is where we think we are today and what we think good, effective, relevant, agile responsive organizations look like. We think we're describing organizations that will do better than the organizations we've probably all grown out of. But actually what's needed 20 years from now, we don't know. We don't know. We like to think our principles are eternal, but actually you don't want them written in stone. And I think it's absolutely right. You know, what people carry from the places they've worked are stories. And they'll tell the stories that illuminate the context in which they find themselves. But you also want them to think, actually, you know, the story that worked 10 years ago doesn't work for me now. So I think, you know, what you hope you do, the one thing you hope you leave people with, is the ability to keep thinking and questioning what they're doing and how they're doing it. Because as smart as I think everybody here is, and as much as I agree with everything they've said, I'll bet we still have some things to learn.
We certainly do have a lot to learn. And I think, Lindsay, since you're a deputy headmaster, I mean, it's about education. There's a lot of debate about how AI will change jobs. There's a lot, you know, how many will go, how many will be gained, how many will be changed. We do know just one thing for sure. The workplace is going to be radically different. And how we embed new types of thinking in the curriculum is absolutely mission critical to the world of AI. We're currently only at the very early stages of that revolution. So we have time to think, but not much time. Think, how do we change education to empower and enable the next generation to cope in a world which will be radically different in a workplace?
Okay, we'll go straight through to the next question. So again, please raise your hands. Anyone up there on the top tier? Yeah, one at the back, thank you. One at the front here. Right. Okay, thanks.
Good morning, I'm Major Samantha Toop. I'm currently Officer Commanding of a medical squadron that we're undergoing a complete restructure. And I'd be interested to know how, whilst at the same time starting to think about new ways of thinking, innovative processes, how we balance that against learning the lessons from the past and still keeping doing the things that we know works.
I think learning the lessons of the past is really important. And, you know, I spent a lot of my life making history films. I'm a big reader of history. I think they're critical. But I also think it's the case that history doesn't repeat itself. We think it does because we're drawn to the similarities and we generally overlook the differences. So I think you ask a great question, which is this tension of how much do we retain and how much do we throw overboard. My personal observation at the moment is we are alarmingly willing to throw overboard almost everything. And I am very struck that, you know, after 20 years of behavioral economics and behavioral sciences, as far as I can see, most people have been persuaded that they're all idiots. You know, that we're biased and we have lazy minds and we have cognitive limits and we make poor decisions under pressure and under stress. And therefore, what we really need to do is hand over to technology, which doesn't get tired, and, you know, will make all of this work impeccably for us. That isn't, you know, I think that is a failure to have confidence in human ingenuity, which is how we all got here in the first place. So I think it comes back to a kind of, if you like, a kind of fundamentally skeptical mindset, which is, yes, this worked for me yesterday. Is it working as well today? If it weren't, what would the signs be? What would the signs be that my management style isn't as effective today as it was last year? Because you're changing and the world is changing, and the lessons that you apply will work until they don't. And the important thing is to be alert to that moment and know it'll come.
It depends on your definition of the past. history is important when it comes to political and structural decisions, and there's a lot to learn. And one of the things we've discovered in all our work is that most people are incredibly ill-informed on history, but that's not really relevant to medicine. And my daughter's a doctor as well, so I relate to what you're saying. But the past can be a few days ago, a few minutes ago, a few months ago. It doesn't have to be in the distant past. And the two things which I would say is you've got to be flexible and you've got to be opportunistic. And there's no shame in going back to something which worked in the past, because it can still work again on a kind of cyclical basis. And part of the problem is there are people who know that it has worked, who don't feel they can pipe up about it. And we see a really serious issue there. And there's no shame in talking about what happened sometime in the past of a few days, a few weeks, a few months, or a few years. But it's about how that gets put into the process which we're all airing here, which is get it out there, as we just heard from David, get it out there, and let's hear it as opposed to sitting on it.
Okay, should we move to the next question? I think I saw Professor Nigel Adams' hand go up. Thank you.
Hello, Nigel Adams, University of Buckingham. I'm all in favour of what you're all saying, absolutely. But Nick, I was at a conference last week with a lot of senior people in business talking about how they can help change the world and do all the right things. But I said there that a lot of my students are quite cynical about big business. They're very much more socially conscious than I think we were. And I just wonder how you can get the message across that you really do mean what you say, because there is quite a lot of cynicism around.
Yeah, this is central to all our work, and in fact the foreword of our book is both by Nick Stern, Lord Nick Stern, but also a 29-year-old saying exactly that. And I think I actually talked briefly about that, and Chris can talk about this as well. But this is a central part of the problem, that the next generation is cynical, not sure it wants to become leaders, and this is why we use the word existential. And I'd be interested in John's framing as you bring in the next cohort of graduates and others, what your expectation is that they will stay inside the civil service, even with the flexibility that you're creating. Because there is this disillusionment, and we are detecting it, and it's something which those at the top are not that willing to talk too openly about, because it affects their share price, their prospects, and it also affects their own reputation, because they've created something which isn't so attractive to the next generation. And so there's a big generational divide.
And it's not just UK either. They might have a lot of international students with very similar views.
Absolutely right, Nigel. I mean, we've looked at examples in Singapore, in Morocco, Norway, and of companies and organizations doing it well. One of the things that seems to unite them is an ability of the senior management to say, I don't know what to do, and to engage the next generation. And it's how some of that multi-generational engagement is being very effective. We find, for example, a Moroccan phosphate company that makes the largest amount of phosphate in the world. It seems a rather unpromising place, but they've radically changed their process of working. They're now doing digital business. They do a lot of stuff environmentally. And that came from the staff, a bit like David describes. Suddenly the staff thought their ideas would be implemented. They improved the quality of their ideas, and we talked to them, and there's palpable enthusiasm of the way they've done it. It can be done. It is very difficult, though. But we're looking for examples of others who've done it, and I think it's really interesting. It can be done. That's one of our key lessons.
And as the microphone moves to John, our book contains case studies which are positive on that front.
I don't quite know how to answer this. It's very interesting. I spent 30 years at the top of industry and some very big companies, and ran some pretty big companies. And then I came to the public sector. And I hadn't really concentrated on the public sector until I got there, and I had no idea, actually, how much it did for most of the people in the country. And what's interesting about it is that, I actually think we've got a far deeper issue, actually. I think we have a bifurcation of society, which is a real problem. Which is manifesting itself in either Trump or, frankly, in this country. We have a bifurcation which is the younger generation. And I do think, by the way, these things move in generations. I have daughters of 20-something. And they move in generations, and the new generation brings a different perspective. And they don't actually want to be like me. They don't want to do what I do. In fact, they rebel against that. And I think that's healthy, and I think it's natural. And I think for those of us who sit at the top, and by the way, it's, you know, the bifurcation of society is financial, which is at the heart. And I don't think it matters what you earn unless you believe somebody else is earning more than they should be in relation to you, and it's sort of financial and money. That's why I made the point. I actually believe the appropriate application of AI that was mentioned a minute ago is that there is too much rent accruing into the professions, into the leadership of industry, into corporate leadership. They're getting too rich. Actually, what I observe going around prisons, schools and hospitals is that we're struggling to attract enough teachers, we're struggling to recruit prison officers, we're struggling to recruit nurses because we simply don't pay them enough money. So what I think is going to happen, and I hope is going to happen, is that the rent that is currently accruing to what we currently call either corporate leadership or the professions today is going to be replaced in large part by AI. And we're going to find a way as a society to move more rent into those areas of society where human beings are talking about and contacting with human beings. And I think that's a really, really important, that's the sort of stuff that governments need to think about. Because over the long term, and it takes a generation or two, but I think we have a broken society. I think those of us sitting, you know, in fancy suits and ties at the top of corporations have had it too easy. And I think I've observed now that, you know, there are people who are simply rewarded for some really, really important things that they do in society. And the question is, how do we deal with it?
The fiscal envelope's the wrong shape, in other words, right? Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what you've said. I've never seen people in power willingly surrender it. So I'm more cynical than you are that actually they won't use AI as a way to protect their stranglehold. And having worked in the tech industry so much of my life, I know they're pretty good at doing that and consolidating power. I would say two things. I think it's really important not to over-worship millennials and think they're a whole new breed of human and they're going to save us. Because I think they're rather as we were at their age. It's just we've forgotten how ambitious and pushy we were. And maybe we need to remember that and retrieve some of it in ourselves. Because I think the sorts of problems that we're talking about here will only really be addressed by the young and the more senior working effectively together. I think John's exactly right, you know, about pay. But I think it's, you know, pay isn't the only way in which people acquire power. They acquire power when you listen to them. They acquire power when you give them a voice and when you give them opportunities, you know, which is what David was talking about. And I think we ought to be more alert to the hidden abilities and talent and power that lies in people at low levels of the organization at every age, because they know more than people on the top. And to the degree that we listen to them, the organization gets smarter.
So I like to play a game I call opposite thinking. And when everybody in society starts thinking one thing, I imagine, well, maybe the opposite's actually true. So when everyone in society says, oh, the new generation is different, kind of pick up where Margaret was, they say, well, maybe they're actually exactly the same. Did the DNA of the human race change in 2 generations? I don't think so. Their behaviors may be different. Well, what characterizes millennials? Well, we know. They don't like to work for someone who's a jerk. Well, I don't like to work for someone who's a jerk. They like to have a say. I like to have a say. They want to have a job that means something. Well, you don't think our grandparents wanted jobs that meant something? Of course they did. But the conditions of the day made it very difficult for them to put that at the top of the ladder. They needed to feed their families. So I personally believe that millennials are exactly the same as us. Their behaviors are different. But what we should be doing is the opposite. We should be learning from the millennials, and that's how we should treat everybody in the workforce. Because wouldn't it be awesome if everyone who was a jerk couldn't get anyone to come work for them?
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. So if we could get the microphone here. I'm being signalled. We've got two more questions, but Sean Taylor, thank you.
Good morning, Sean Taylor. An observation on the millennial conversation. We have actually all been millennials. It's just that the ability to communicate for the millennials, the channels of distribution are that much quicker and are that much more in your face. So we have all been millennials. And the millennial boom will happen probably in the States next year when they become, oh, I better get married, I want to buy a house, I'm going to have children. We've all generations, and key economists are picking up on that now. And seeing as we're here today for the Centre of Army Leadership, I'd like particularly put this to John regarding the civil service. Is it now not time for the civil service to recognise those leadership qualities that come from service and the military in particular? Because that's a generation that's been excluded from civil service because they didn't fit with what was required to be the new generation of prison officers, police officers, etc., and that the civil service should now actively encourage, as the National Health Service has done, for people to take their leadership skills from the military into the civil service.
You're right. I mean, and actually the answer is yes, we should. Although I would say to you that, and I do actually think that the army and the forces, the armed forces have strong leadership development activities, and like everything, it's a blend, right? I've said that leadership is in a context. So if you go, and I would, you know, I mean, I spent a lot of time talking to Nick Carter, who used to run the army, now runs the force, and he's a complete modernizer. He wants to find the best solution within the constraints that he's in. He's a very forward-thinking man, and I think he's a great leader, actually. I think he's been, you know, in that sense, he's been very good. Now, the question is, though, does that work in completely in a different context? Not easily. So the question is, how do you get the right blend? So, you know, of course there are characteristics of military leadership that we need to have more of, but that's not all we need more of. We need the whole blend of different things, right? Leadership is in its context.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also say there's a whole body of research into, you know, people who cross disciplines. It's been very fashionable for people, you know, to go out of public service into business and vice versa. In the United States, you saw things like heads of publishing companies starting to run New York's education system. Mostly this fails. And mostly it fails because the people who make the transition think they know more than they do. They don't spend as much time acquiring understanding of the ecosystem that they're now a part of. They don't have the good luck, as David had, of making a fabulous mistake really early, right? And they think it's all the same. They think, well, you know, education is kind of the same as selling magazines, which is the same as running prisons, which is the same as running a restaurant. And actually, it's really important to understand the differences. So I think, you know, I think the cross-fertilization of these disciplines has value. And as somebody who's had probably at least three careers by now, you know, I do believe people can adapt and change. But I think it's really tricky if you try to do that right at the top. Because, you know, people below feel like the whole discipline has been disparaged. Like, wow, you can come in and run this company and you know nothing about anything that we do. And so I think it's harder than it looks. And it's easy to explain the reluctance of organizations to do this by saying they just don't like us. But it's much harder than it looks. And I think we could be more imaginative. But if you're going to make this kind of radical transition in the face of the data that says it mostly doesn't work, you have to think about what do we need to put in place to make it more likely to succeed.
Can I just pick up on your observation there? I think you're in danger of devaluing a very serious demographic, economic, and other issues to do with the next generation, whether it's millennials or whatever. Interesting, the piece we've published today in City AM, one didn't want to use the phrase next gen. What is it? There's a vagueness here, but at the Future of the Corporation conference last week, Frances Cairncross, who was principal of Hertford College until I think 3 years ago, she said 4 years ago everyone wanted to go into the city. Now they all want to start up and they don't want to go into the city. And that's a profound change in ambition. They may all in the end, when they get to a certain age with children and everything else, and want a guaranteed salary. But that is a profound change which every single organization has to accept. And that is fundamental to some of the unthinkables which are emerging, that actually, and company insiders have said this to us, companies are going to face difficulties recruiting people. Being in a large organization with suspect purpose of exploiting people is no longer attractive to the next generation, and that's something that the next gen, the current generation have to get very clear in their mind, as came out from Colin Mayer last week. This is now about a new purpose, and if you get that wrong, you may be close to the scrap heap. As a company, companies are surviving far shorter times now, because the customers, which means the next gen, are alienated by much of what they do. And that is changing fast. One of our case studies is of a big telco in East Africa, Safaricom, which almost collapsed in weeks because it didn't understand that the next gen didn't like its data bundles, and it was almost illiquid within weeks. It's now doing well because it responded amazingly quickly.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we could probably have many more, but I think that due to the schedule, we're just going to have to pull stumps on this one.